Few places on Earth are as unforgiving as the Australian outback, a place often compared to a post-apocalyptic wasteland, like something out of a Mad Max movie, but without the glamour. When we think of extreme heat, the Sahara is usually the first name that comes to mind. However, the Sahara has a natural defense. Its sand reflects a massive portion of solar radiation back into space, preventing the ground from storing too much energy. The outback is a different story. Much of this territory is a dense landscape of rock and iron ore, materials that act like a giant thermal battery. This ground doesn't reflect heat, it absorbs it, with surface temperatures frequently peaking at 158 degrees Fahrenheit. This creates what experts describe as a convection oven effect. In most places, a breeze offers relief. Here, the moving air only serves to accelerate the burning of your skin. There is no such thing as a cooling wind in the deep outback. It is a literal furnace where the heat index becomes so oppressive that you would find yourself wishing for the relative mercy of the Sahara. You might be familiar with the legendary, brutal expeditions that first tried to cross this void. But today, we're going to analyse two modern cases that remain largely unknown to the public. Stories that demonstrate, in terrifying detail, how this environment remains one of the deadliest traps on the planet. In 1958, the Page family traded the cool, predictable climate of England for the relentless, unforgiving furnace of the Australian outback. They settled in Marrie, a desolate railway junction in South Australia that feels less like a town and more like an outpost at the edge of the world. To understand the heat they faced, consider this. Local recordings in Marrie often show ambient temperatures hitting 111 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade, while thermometers placed in the direct sun easily spike past 140 degrees. For a family arriving from the British Isles, this wasn't just a change of scenery, it was a biological shock. The patriarch, 48-year-old Ernest Ernie Frederick Page, worked as a heavy-duty mechanic. His daily life consisted of battling machines that had surrendered to the outback's heat, maintaining the massive diesel locomotives and support vehicles that kept the railway lines breathing. Ernie was an expert at preparing vehicles for the infamous Birdsville track, the very road that would eventually become his family's final destination. By late 1958, the isolation of Marrie had taken its toll. Following a heated dispute with his employer just days before Christmas, Ernie decided he had seen enough. He quit his job on the spot, determined to lead his family away from the dust and the heat. He loaded his Ford Custom Line V8 and a standard 6x4-foot trailer with supplies, crates of food, extra fuel, and canisters of water. It was the height of the Australian summer, a season where the Birdsville track transforms into a treacherous corridor of shifting sand and shimmering heat waves. Even then, the dangers were common knowledge. Entering that void with a loaded trailer and a young family was more than just a risk. It was a flirtation with a tragedy. With everything ready, they set off. About an hour and a half later, a vehicle appeared from the opposite direction and slowed down as it approached. It could have been just another passing car in the middle of nowhere, but it wasn't. In that car was Robert, the family's eldest son. He recognised his father's car and asked the driver to pull over. That day, Robert had left Clifton Hills Station, where he worked, intending to spend Christmas with his family in Marrie. He was hitching a ride with a male driver. After a brief conversation, Robert decided to join them. Even with the car already at its load limit, he placed his suitcase on the trailer, squeezed into the available space, and continued the journey with his family. At that time, the track was much more rugged, rarely travelled, and poorly defined. The tracks left on the ground could disappear in a matter of days, blown away by the constant desert winds. At a certain point, the route had been cut off by the flooding of Cooper Creek, forcing them to detour several miles to a crossing point. The river could only be crossed by a ferry, operated by a man named Ernie Park, the last person known to have seen them alive. What happened next was never fully explained, but the remains found later allow us to reconstruct part of their path. During the journey, the family would have passed the ruins of the Mulca store, once known as the loneliest store in the world. It was a vital landmark on the Birdsville track, providing one of the few sources of artesian well water in the region. However, by the late 1950s, the profitability of the cattle stations along the track was declining due to prolonged droughts, and many of these support outposts were being abandoned or operated with minimal staff. The decline of this rural support network meant that travellers like the Pages had fewer safe havens than those of previous decades, who could rely on a denser network of camel drivers, drovers, and settlers. Even at its peak, the store received only 2 or 3 visitors per week and was the only shop in over 70,000 square miles of desolation. The road consisted of sections covered in stones of various sizes, capable of easily damaging tyres and striking the undercarriage of the vehicle with every impact. Ernest Page had modified the car, welding a custom bar to the gearbox to make gear shifting easier under heavy loads, a common practice at the time. Catastrophically, the weld failed under the harsh track conditions and snapped. The vehicle became permanently stuck in second gear. As an experienced mechanic, Ernest immediately understood the implications. To maintain the speed necessary to cross dunes or sandy terrain, the V8 engine would have to run at high RPMs, resulting in much higher fuel consumption. With no other choice, the decision was to keep moving forward. However, the excessive gasoline consumption drained the tanks much sooner than expected. The vehicle came to a definitive halt near Deadman's Sandhill, an area devoid of natural shade and far from any water source. They remained with the car for approximately 2 days. During this time, they consumed the water they were carrying and eventually resorted to the vehicle's radiator water, which, though chemically contaminated and hot, represented their last reserve. Before abandoning the vehicle, the family left a note that read, "The Page family of Mary, out of petrol. Have only enough water for 2 days. December 24th. The use of the word petrol instead of petrol perhaps reflects the haste or the high state of stress they were under. The following morning, Robert tried, without success, to help his father repair the custom gear bar. By this point, they must have known they were in deep trouble. Ernie and Robert spotted an old windmill a few miles away and set off with a 4-gallon drum, which they filled. They then used a long pole to help them carry the heavy load back to the car. Ironically, the physical exertion required to fetch the water only accelerated their dehydration. The windmills in the outback pump water from the Great Artesian Basin. While used for livestock, this water is typically extremely brackish and heavily loaded with minerals. Back at the vehicle, their thoughts turned toward Christmas. It was becoming increasingly clear that there would be no celebrations. I can only imagine how Emma, the mother, must have felt with her 2 young boys. They had been there for 2 days, likely realizing that no one was coming for them. They hadn't told anyone about their specific plans, and no one was expecting them in Birdsville. They hadn't crossed paths with any other travellers because the track was completely deserted during the holiday. Realizing they would die if they stayed put, Ernie, Emma, their sons, Douglas and Gordon, and the eldest, Robert, abandoned the vehicle. Carrying only a few containers of water, their plan was to walk roughly 31 miles to reach Clifton Hill Station. The family managed to trek about 18 miles through the scorching heat. They wandered aimlessly, constantly re-evaluating their path and searching for landmarks that simply didn't exist. At some point, likely on December 26th or the following day, the Pages sat down to rest under a large tree where their bodies would eventually be found. By then, they were presumably too exhausted and dehydrated to take another step. Robert, being the youngest and in the best physical condition, watched his family succumb and made one final desperate effort to find help. He climbed to the top of a massive sand dune, removed his shirt, and tied it to an exposed branch, a signal for anyone who might look for them. He then descended the dune and began to build a shelter by digging into the cooler sand, an ancient Aboriginal survival technique. Tragically, he passed away before he could finish. On December 29th, the truck and trailer were found by chance by a driver delivering supplies to a mustering camp. Upon examining the vehicle and reading the note, he knew immediately that this was a desperate situation. He raced to Clifton Hill Station to raise the alarm, and the news reached the Birdsville police. Knowing that time was of the essence, the police contacted local cattle stations. Ranchers with their own aircraft took to the skies to assist. As more people joined the search, the South Australian police were notified and deployed 4x4 vehicles with Aboriginal trackers. It was a search plane that made the initial discovery, spotting several bodies clustered near the base of a large tree in the middle of the red void. The search planes transmitted the coordinates to the ground teams, and by 4 p.m. on New Year's Eve, they reached the remains of the Page family. They were clustered under a coulee bar, roughly 12 miles east of their abandoned vehicle. The bodies of Ernest, Emma, Douglas, and Gordon were found together, suggesting they had stopped to seek shelter from the relentless sun before finally succumbing to exhaustion. Robert Page, the eldest son, was located the following day about 3/4 of a mile away at the base of a towering sandhill known as Deadman's Dune. In a chilling historical coincidence, other bodies had been discovered at that same spot 80 years earlier. In the mid-1880s, 9 men had set out on foot from Birdsville to Inaminka during the December heat. 4 of them turned back after walking over 60 miles. They were later found dead in the very same dunes where Robert's journey ended. Looking at a map, you might see riverbeds near where the family perished, but these water lines are a deadly illusion. For 90% of the year, they remain completely dry. During the Australian summer, evaporation is so brutal that any trace of moisture vanishes, leaving behind only cracked clay crusts. The iconic coolibah trees survive here only because of deep roots that hunt for moisture far beneath the surface. When you consider that the vehicle was found just 4 days after the final collapse, the mathematics of survival becomes revealing. At absolute rest and in the shade, the human body requires about 2 litres of water per day to maintain vital functions in extreme heat. However, once you choose to trek under the desert sun, that requirement jumps to nearly 10 litres daily. The physical exertion of the family generated an immense metabolic cost. It is probable that if they had remained sheltered by the vehicle, rationing every drop of sweat, they might have endured until the rescue. But even that is uncertain. The interior of a metal car in the 1950s, lacking any modern thermal insulation, can easily reach 158 degrees Fahrenheit, 70 degrees Celsius. They could have died of heat stroke even if they had remained hydrated. The investigation ultimately confirmed that the family had drifted off the main route. At the time, mining companies were conducting seismic surveys in the area, leaving tyre tracks and stakes that could easily be mistaken for the primary road by someone unfamiliar with the terrain. Due to the condition of the remains, the decision was made to bury the family near where they were found. In 2010, a memorial plaque was installed at the site, serving as both a tribute to the Pages and a stark warning to modern travellers about the lethal indifference of the outback. If you look at a map of Australia, the landmass is vast enough to comfortably fit 2 entire Indias within its borders. Yet, the population tells a completely different story. While India is home to 1.4 billion people, Australia sustains only 26 million, and nearly 85% of them are crowded within just 31 miles of the coast. This leaves the interior of the continent in a state of total isolation. Deep in the outback, human presence is so rare that the mathematical probability of a chance encounter with another person is virtually zero. This demographic vacuum gave rise to a business model unique in the world, that of mega cattle stations. In the global cattle industry, success is measured by head of cattle per hectare. But the Australian outback forces an inversion of that logic. Here, the metric is hectares per animal. The soil is so depleted and the climate so unforgiving that a single cow requires between 50 and 250 acres of land to survive. To put that in perspective, in the United States or Brazil, that same patch of land could sustain over 100 animals. This geographical created farm the size of small European nations. These are autonomous worlds where fences vanish into the curvature of the earth and thousands of miles of tracks snake through dry riverbeds and sparse scrubland. Because the distances are so vast, logistics become a predator. Transporting cattle to ports or processing plants requires massive road trains crossing thousands of miles of absolute nothingness. To compete with the global market under these conditions, a ruthless business model emerged, one that prioritized livestock over human life. This era was personified by figures like Peter Sherwin, the largest Australian landowner of the 1980s. Under this regime, the use of teenagers between 16 and 18 as cheap labour became a systemic, quietly accepted practice. The cattle barons didn't want seasoned ranch hands who knew exactly when to call in the union. Instead, they looked for city boys from Sydney, kids who grew up believing that life out here was nothing more than a Marlboro commercial. Short ads were placed in major city newspapers, targeting boys looking for their first job or an escape from school. These teenagers were the perfect cogs in the machine. They rarely complained about conditions and accepted orders that experienced stockmen would have questioned instantly. The promise was always wild adventure, with no experience required. What the ads omitted was the soul-crushing isolation and the total lack of survival training or basic mechanical skills. Among the thousands of city kids lured by these ads were two teenagers whose lives would soon become a grim cautionary tale. At just 17, Simon Amos had left New South Wales, traded his familiar surroundings for the brutal daily grind of Nicholson Station. Roughly 60 miles away, at Sturt Creek Station, was 16-year-old James Annetts. Shying away from the academic path in Adelaide, James wanted to prove his maturity to his family. In October 1986, he accepted a one-way ticket funded by the company, landing in the far north of Australia with high hopes and zero experience. The reality on the ground was a nightmare of neglect. At Nicholson, James lived in near-total solitude. His daily routine involved driving an aging, precarious vehicle over 150 miles of dirt tracks just to check water bores, all without a single soul nearby to offer support if something went wrong. Simon, over at Sturt Creek, faced a similar degradation. Police would later describe his living quarters as revoltingly filthy, where spoiled food was the norm. Although they worked on different properties, both stations belonged to the same conglomerate, making encounters between workers inevitable. In this harsh landscape, James and Simon became inseparable. They were the city boys, in a world of desert-hardened veterans, men who rarely spoke to the newcomers. In a system that treated them as disposable parts, their friendship became the only psychological shield they had against the cultural shock of the outback. On December 1st, 1986, during a rare day off, the two friends decided to meet. Simon left Nicholson Station and headed to the Sturt Creek area where James was. Each young man had access to a farm vehicle which they used for work, but that day they only went out with one, Simon's white Datsun Ute. The other remained on the property. Without a clear destination, they decided to just drive around the area. The vehicle was a light utility vehicle with simple rear-wheel drive, sufficient for dirt roads, but inadequate for areas of soft sand. Even so, they continued. Without a communication radio, without extra water, and without basic equipment for unforeseen events. Leaving the station limits, the young men entered the so-called seismic lines. Created by mineral exploration companies, these trails were perfectly straight, stretching for hundreds of kilometers towards nowhere. From this point on, we enter the field of forensic reconstruction. The sequence of events is what the experts believe likely occurred. As the friends moved forward, the firm gravel gave way to the soft sand and linear, hot dunes of the outback. After about 4 hours, probably between 3 p.m. and 5 p.m, the car got stuck in a sandbar approximately 160 kilometres from the farm. James and Simon tried to get the car unstuck. The marks in the sand found months later suggest that they dug with their hands and used what they had in the utility vehicle to try to give traction to the wheels, but they couldn't. They probably stayed in the car for about 3 to 4 days, sleeping in the cabin and in the bed of the Datsun. During this time, they consumed the little water they had, estimated at only a few litres. After the 4th day, with no sign of rescue and with their water depleted, they decided to leave the shadow of the car to try to walk back to the farm headquarters, a distance impossible to cover on foot without water. Before leaving, they left an SOS sign on the roof of the vehicle made with wrenches, 2 branches, and a stake pointing north. Then they started walking. It is estimated that they walked for about 24 to 48 hours after abandoning the vehicle. The 2 teenagers managed to travel about 18 kilometres before the heat forced them to stop. It was there that the isolation finally overcame them. Simon reached a point of no return, leaving a .22 caliber rifle as the only silent witness to his final moments. James and Ets, now facing the desert completely alone, continued north for another kilometre before succumbing. 4 months after they vanished, on April 21st, 1987, 2 surveyors, Andy Brett and Greg Owens, spotted the abandoned Datsun among the dunes. They alerted the station management, who finally notified the Halls Creek police. By April 22nd, the boys' parents had travelled into the heart of the outback to see the vehicle for themselves. The police had failed to conduct a thorough search on foot. It was James's father, Bob Annetts, who began walking the perimeter of the car. Just a few yards away, he discovered something the authorities had overlooked: the boys' shoes, neatly lined up. This was a sign of thermal delirium, a state where the victim feels an unbearable burning sensation and begins to shed their clothing. The following day, a helicopter spotted a dark shape 11 miles north of the truck. It was Simon Amos, lying near a tree. His remains were completely bleached by the sun. Only white bones remained, with no trace of tissue or hair. His skull bore a single bullet hole in the forehead, consistent with the rifle found by his side. James Annetts was located another mile further north, but his condition was disturbingly different. Unlike Simon, James's face still had skin, muscle tissue was visible, and his red hair remained intact. Witnesses were baffled. How could 2 bodies exposed to the exact same conditions for 5 months show such radical differences in decomposition? Beside James, police recovered the lid of a water container. On it, he had carved a final message to his family. "James, my fault. I will always love you, Mum and Dad, Jason, Michelle and Joanne." On the side, he added a haunting final thought: "I have found peace." They died in the red sands of northwestern Australia, one of the most inhospitable and scorched places on the face of the earth.